Hello everyone, Mike and Matt here. Today we're going to be doing something slightly different.
We're delighted to be welcoming an expert guest to the podcast. In today's episode, we are exploring the rise in popularity of natural cycle contraception. This is the identifying of fertile days through tracking of menstrual cycles.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that in this episode we'll primarily refer to women when discussing contraception. However, we recognise that not all individuals who may need or use contraception identify as women. This includes transgender men, non-binary individuals, and others. Our goal is to provide information that is helpful and inclusive, and we respect and support all gender identities.
I would also like to highlight that the British Pregnancy Advisory Service survey statistics that I mentioned early on, quoting reduction in contraceptive use and a rise in natural cycle contraceptive methods, these statistics are specific to women who have presented for termination of pregnancy and are the methods that they have reported at presentation. I think that's important context that I don't really make clear in the episode. It is also worth pointing out that we haven't covered in great depth the non-contraceptive benefits of hormonal contraceptives in this episode, of which there are many. These can include regulation of irregular menstrual cycles, treatment for painful periods, and improvement of acne, for example.
I hope you find this episode as interesting and as informative as we both did. Let's get started.
Welcome to Beyond the Limits with your hosts Matt Clark and my co-host Mike Forsythe. Today we're talking about natural fertility contraception. Natural fertility contraception is the ditching of traditional methods of contraception in favour of things like monitoring of your menstrual cycle. With Instagram now awash with influencers promoting apps to facilitate this, and an observation of an increase in those undertaking abortions reporting this as their contraceptive method, we thought it was time to zoom in a little bit and find out what might be going on here. And now, before you ask, why on earth are you two men discussing this? It's certainly not my wheelhouse and certainly not my area of expertise. I'm pretty sure it's not yours as well, Mike. Why don't you now introduce our special guest?
It's a real pleasure to have someone I know quite well, and that is Dr. Annabelle Forsythe. Now, I'm going to attempt your job title, and it's going to be quite embarrassing if I don't know this, but... Am I right in thinking that you are a consultant in contraceptive and sexual health? Is that correct?
Yes. Technically, my title is Consultant in Community Sexual and Reproductive Healthcare.
Annie, thank you so much for joining us. And as Matt says, you are a much more authoritative voice than either myself or Matt on this subject. So really looking forward to quizzing you and to putting you on the spot and really to look in a bit more depth in this quite interesting topic. Weirdly enough, since deciding to do this topic, there seemingly have been more and more articles in the paper about this contraceptive method and I guess about contraception more generally. So a really topical issue to address. Matt, why don't you kick us off here?
Well, we're going to focus on two parts. The first one is looking at this rather compelling data from the British Pregnancy Advisory Service statistics. The reported use of fertility awareness-based methods of contraception has gone up quite considerably. So this study was looking at from 2018 to 2023, so 5 years later. The use of the methods has gone up from 0.4% to 2.5%. It doesn't sound like a huge jump, but I think across the population that is quite a lot of women, isn't it? In the same batch of data, the report of hormonal methods of contraception has decreased from 18.8% over the same period, over the same 5 years, down to 11.3%. Before we dig into that a little bit, I thought, Annie, you might be able to frame this conversation, maybe starting off with where... when did we actually first start using hormonal contraception? Because it was a bit of a game changer.
Absolutely. Just caveat this with I'm not an expert on the history of contraception, although it is a really interesting topic. Up until the 1960s, hormonal contraception didn't really exist. So prior to that, contraception was being used. And back to the 17th century, there were reports of condoms and sheaths made of animal intestines and the like, and stones put in camels' uteruses, etc. But in the 60s, that was when all the exciting stuff was happening, when the pill came onto the market in the UK. And when we're talking about hormones and contraception, I think it's important to remember how transformative the appearance of the pill was at that point for society, for women being able to have sex without fear of pregnancy, put their careers first and space their families more effectively. I'm sure we're going to come on to talk about why people might be ditching the hormonal methods, but I think the first nice thing to say is that we're still incredibly lucky to have them, and I think it's easy to look at the negatives of them, but they have made a massive difference to society and people's lives.
So with that in mind, Annie, talk to us a little bit about these fertility awareness methods. I find the subject quite triggering in a way, because being sent to Catholic boarding school and having sex education that was delivered purely by monks, it was very much the recommendation that this was the only form of contraception. An interesting topic, and it feels strange to me that this has come back into the public domain. Have you got much experience about this? Is this something that you see in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that we're seeing. It almost feels like we've gone full circle and people are moving back to the more traditional methods that people have used for many centuries around timing when they have sex. Things like diaphragms and barrier methods. I'm seeing a lot more women choosing those than I was when I first became a trainee in contraception, and they were really seen then as almost on their way out, and lots of these things do seem to be making a comeback. And when we're talking about the natural family planning methods, there are a number of different methods that you can use, but essentially the mainstay of most of them is plotting your cycles. So it's called a calendar method. So keeping a record of your cycle over several months and trying to figure out your fertile periods. And some of them use other indicators like temperature monitoring, vaginal secretion monitoring, what your cervix feels like, so whether your cervix is high or low in your cycle.
That's really interesting. Is that all done typically on just a diary?
Yeah, so that was how it always has been done, but in the last few years there've obviously been loads of snazzy apps developed to do this, and the one that a lot of people have heard of is Natural Cycles, which is FDA approved as a contraceptive method and claims very high rates of effectiveness. So I think it quotes high 90s% of effectiveness at preventing pregnancy. And really it is just a method of recording all of that information in one place. But again, it's only as good as the information that you input to it.
I looked a bit at Natural Cycles, and the distinction that I could see from that to a lot of these other monitoring methods, i.e. checking when your last period was, or how long your cycle is, or diarising how you might be feeling, or the secretions that you talked about. Am I right in thinking Natural Cycles is the one that's specifically monitoring temperature?
Part of it does involve monitoring daily temperatures as well.
To flash my ignorance here, could you maybe just explain what happens to your temperature during your cycle?
So your temperature rises post-ovulation. So in the latter half of the cycle, which is called the luteal phase of the cycle, your temperature is marginally higher than in your follicular phase of your cycle. So the temperature helps in retrospect. If you've monitored several cycles in a row, then it helps to map out the pattern of them. But you can't use it prospectively, if you like. If I started measuring my temperature every day in a cycle, wanting to use purely temperature method, by the time my temperature had gone up, it would be too late, because I'd have already been having sex throughout my fertile period.
Is it a case of each person might be slightly different as well, and you have to establish a trend with these monitoring before you can rush in and say, here's a temperature?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that is important is that other things can change temperature. So we've all had absolute loads of winter bugs, haven't we? And things like drinking alcohol can change your temperature, things like taking paracetamol or medications. So that's why the more reliable natural family planning methods rely on multiple indicators. So the more different things that you measure in combination make it more reliable than one thing alone.
And Annie, on this Natural Cycles itself, I had a look on their website as well. They claim their product is 93% effective under typical use, and under perfect use, this goes up to 98%. So do you mind explaining the difference between typical use and perfect use?
I think typical use is the most useful thing, because typical use tells you the failure rate in real life. Perfect use is under strict trial conditions where people are using methods absolutely perfectly and following it exactly as they should, 100% of the time, and inputting all of the data, etc. Typical use is real life. And so I think when we quote effectiveness levels for contraception, typical use is the important number to remember. And one of the important things about typical and perfect use, I suppose, is that the longer acting methods, so LARCs, long acting reversible contraception, often there is little or no difference between typical and perfect use because it's something that's put in. Once it's in, you don't have to particularly do anything about it to make it work. Whereas something like the natural fertility methods, there will be a wide gap between perfect use and typical use because they're really difficult to use and they require quite a lot of discipline. They require quite a lot of knowledge of your own body. And for natural family planning methods as well, they require avoiding sex at times of your cycle, which, as we know, people can't and don't always plan for.
Just leading on from that, I was reading that the natural cycles, and by no means picking on this one particular company, there were lots of companies that are doing this. I'm just referencing this because I think it's perhaps the most well known, but I understand they had to remove the phrase highly accurate contraceptive that they were using in an advert because I think it was deemed that that wasn't a claim that they could particularly make. It also loops back to a lot of the themes that we've been covering in this podcast before about how things are promoted on social media. I guess, Matt, this is the case for this as well, right?
Yes, totally. We've talked a bit about algorithms and the marketing of these products. The more people that these products market to and the more people these products reach, the more influence they have. In many cases, these are young women as well who might not have great understanding of the different options. I have some concerns with it being marketed by an Instagram influencer with hashtag hormone free, and how that to a young person might be quite a powerful statement of like, oh, I definitely don't want hormones, and how that might vilify what have been amazing breakthrough medicines to stop people getting pregnant. And the implications of obviously getting this wrong is an unwanted life or an abortion. But yes, it harks back to these companies, and I'm aware that Natural Cycles have been marketing their particular product quite heavily. They will pay influencers to take a fairly attractive looking photo in an attractive environment and then have some text underneath about why it's important to go back to basics and be hashtag hormone free.
I think there are some real positives to it, and I think we'll come on to that. And I think women, we do need more, and women should be listened to regarding their contraceptive choices. But I think it's just a shame because look at what money and marketing can do. And you think if we did that for some of the other contraceptive methods, or if we put more money into contraceptive research and we developed more effective methods that didn't have unwanted side effects, then think what we could do. Contraception has historically been a bit of a Cinderella service, and there hasn't been a huge amount of money in it, and it's not that often we get a new method come along and we realise none of the methods we have are perfect. The other thing I want to say is that there's a real trend for natural everything at the moment, isn't there? And hormone free is seen as a good thing. And I think, gosh, none of us are hormone free. We're contending with our own natural cycles and our own fluctuations in hormones with our ovarian cycles. And for some people, that can be really destructive. For 2-3 weeks of the month, they might feel horrific or not be very functional or productive. And hormones can be really helpful with that. And there are loads of other potential benefits to hormonal contraception. And I think those are often missed in this social media wave of interest where we talk a lot about the negatives, but no one really writes the good stuff.
I think that's a really good point. So I've tried to look at the evidence for these fertility awareness methods in a little bit more detail. So thinking about the efficacy first of all, so the Sexual and Reproductive Health version of the British Medical Journal in 2024 essentially stated the accepted efficacy of these methods. So what they stated was that the typical use failure rate from 2 to 23 per 100 in the first year of use, compared with 7 in 100 for combined hormonal methods, and less than 1 in 100 for intrauterine contraception, so your coils, for instance. So numbers that are particularly quite broad in that, and I think I'll hopefully explain a little bit where the limitations of the studies comes from. I then had a look at a Swedish study from 2019. They actually had a look at over 16,000 natural cycle users, and they used something called the Pearl Index, which I believe it calculates the number of unintended pregnancies that occur per 100 woman years of exposure to a particular contraceptive method. As far as I'm aware, a single woman year means one woman using a contraceptive method for 1 year, which I guess makes sense. So you want a low Pearl index number for a contraceptive to be good, and a higher PI number is bad. Annie, am I talking complete rubbish, or am I vaguely on track here?
No, that's correct. So it's the number of women who will get pregnant out of 100 women using a contraceptive method over a year's duration.
I should have just asked you to say that in the first place, because that would have been a lot quicker. So they actually mentioned some of the limitations of the studies. So looking at this particular demographic, they had quite significant dropout rates, which can affect the reliability, because are these women dropping out because they've got pregnant? But the results essentially showed that the efficacy of this method varied depending on what method of contraception the woman had been on previously. So for women who'd used condoms before, the Pearl index of natural cycles was the lowest at around 3.5. And for women who had used the pill before, the Pearl index was highest at 8.1.
I think part of that is actually because you need to wait at least 3 cycles after stopping a hormonal method before you start to use a natural family planning method. And ideally, you want to monitor really for a year before you start to rely on it for contraception. So if women have just been using condoms, they'll already have more awareness of what their cycle is. They may have even been plotting it for a lot longer, because even if you're not using it as a contraceptive method, lots of women use an app to track their period, just to know when to expect their period. But women who've been on the injection, for example, could take up to a year for your periods to come back into a regular pattern.
That's a really important point to make, isn't it? Because those women, if they're ditching hormonal contraceptive because they want to be off hormones, then are they aware that, they might need to be abstinent from sex for a year or using condoms for a year before they can accurately or more accurately use this method?
I think that's one big limitation, but also not everyone has regular cycles, and these methods just don't work well for women with irregular cycles because their ovulation isn't predictable.
Going back to the evidence that you looked at, Mike, you were looking at the failure rate for these fertility awareness-based methods, and you quoted something from 2 to 23 in 100. I'm reading that as up to 23%. I read on the NHS, the guidance was that if these methods are used incorrectly, the failure rate can be up to, I think it was 23%. So I'm assuming that's that same statistic.
It's the same as withdrawal method,
Wow.
pretty much, which most people wouldn't consider to be reliable enough.
I do have a very vivid recollection of a fellow doctor when I was a junior doctor coming up to me and boasting that he had been using, as he said, the only 100% reliable form of contraception of withdrawal, and then he got quite a shock when I told him that wasn't the case.
That's a great example of survivorship bias, isn't it? This method really works until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't. Yeah.
Annie, so I wanted to ask, just going back to this particular method. So what advice do you give, or would you give, to a patient who asks you about this?
Yeah, so I think we'd have a good conversation about how important it is to them not to be pregnant, because there are different times of life where you don't want to be pregnant, or you really, really, really don't want to be pregnant. So if it's important that you really, really, really don't want to be pregnant, then you need to be thinking about one of the more reliable methods of contraception. But these methods can be brilliant for women who are perhaps planning to start a family in 6 months, a year's time, and it will help them get some awareness of their cycle and their fertile periods. And if they were to become pregnant, it's not the biggest disaster, it's just a little bit earlier than they were planning. I would have a bit of a conversation around that, and then explore some of the reasons why they might be thinking of that rather than other methods, and take it from there. But I think there are some real pros to the sort of revisiting these methods. The main one is that I'm seeing lots of younger women who have developed a much better understanding of how their body works, who previously had no idea really what went on with their own menstrual cycle, and come to me and go, it's been quite enlightening, really. I've learned so much about myself. And I think knowledge is power from that point of view. There can be knock-on effects with understanding of how your mood changes and your productivity changes, whether you want to exercise or take it easy for that. I think there are lots of benefits that people can experience from those. But I think they just need to be aware that A, there's a lot of discipline and input involved, and B, there are higher failure rates. And the third point, the C, would be that it does restrict when you can have sex. And that's not really talked about much, but actually a lot of people feel like having sex more around about the time of ovulation, because that's what their own hormones are telling them they feel like doing, because that is our clever physiology, the way our bodies work. And so it may be that using natural fertility methods is preventing you from having sex at the times where you want to.
Going back to some of the risks with the hormonal contraceptive. So I do community vasectomies as a GP, and I think I'd say that most men, when asked why they're having a vasectomy, they'll often quote something along the lines of, "It's my turn to do something about this," or "It's not fair on my wife to continue using hormonal contraception." There seems to be a trend away from hormonal contraception. Is it worth touching on what are the risks of hormonal contraception?
So the risks are slightly different depending on which hormonal contraception you're talking about, but I suppose common to all of the hormonal contraceptive methods is a very slightly increased risk of breast cancer, which obviously is a very real concern for a lot of people. But in younger women, we're looking at a very, very tiny increased risk. So it's an extra 8 per 100,000 cases on an already very rare occurrence. And that risk does increase a bit in the older age groups. But hormonal contraceptives are protective against endometrial cancer and ovarian cancer. There are good and bad to all hormonal methods. In terms of other risks, so combined hormonal methods that contain estrogen and progestogen, the main risks that we think about with those is a very slightly increased risk of having a blood clot, so a deep vein thrombosis or a PE. Again, that's something that's really rare in young, fit, healthy people, but we weigh up various factors to try and estimate if someone might be at a higher risk of one of those things happening and whether that may or may not be a safe option for them. And there are also some incredibly rare side effects and risks that happen once in a blue moon, but have been doing the rounds on social media. So things like implants ending up in the wrong place, something that I think is a very valid concern and probably a positive thing that's been going around on social media is more talk about pain and experiences of IUD fittings. I love IUDs and IUSs and I fit them pretty much every day at work. I do everything I can to make them pain-free, but I think there's still a long way that we can go. And I think it's brilliant that we're talking about these things, because why should women go through pain for their contraceptive methods? So some of the social media trends have highlighted really important concerns and made healthcare professionals listen to women.
I think that's an interesting angle, and it's not really one that we consider so much. I always felt very awkward in my practice as a GP when I was counselling someone about a Mirena coil or any kind of coil, and saying to them, "Oh, well, it shouldn't hurt. It might just be a bit uncomfortable," because to be completely blunt, what the hell do I know? It always felt quite odd saying that. And I think acknowledging that is a problem and that's potentially what puts people off this method is really important, because ultimately that's where things can improve, right?
And I think also it's a problem with trust and people losing trust in healthcare professionals. If we say, "Oh, this won't hurt," or "This will just be a little bit uncomfortable," and then a person comes out having had a traumatic experience and feeling like they've had a huge amount of pain, then they feel that they've been lied to, and that further reinforces the sort of mistrust in contraception. And
I think it's really interesting to outline the risks and the benefits of the hormonal contraceptive options there. That's really helpful. What I want to do is to try and loop this back towards maybe understanding why do we think this is actually happening? Why do we think there is this move away from hormonal methods?
I don't think anyone knows the complete answer to that, but I think hormones certainly have quite a bad rep at the moment, and some of that is for good reason. So if you are on a hormone that doesn't suit you, it may make you feel really sad and down. It may make your skin bad. So the hormonal methods can have unwanted side effects, for sure. And there's an increased awareness of that. And women in the 60s, it was like, whoa, great, we won't get pregnant. This is brilliant. There was maybe a higher threshold for putting up with side effects. And now we rightfully want better. We want to be able to not get pregnant, but we also don't want to feel rubbish because of our contraception. And that doesn't seem like too much to ask, to be fair. And I believe most women can ultimately find a contraception that works for them, but not everyone. So we do need more options. We need better non-hormonal options. The IUD is brilliant, but it's not for everyone. It's not great for women with endometriosis, heavy periods, adenomyosis, all these gynecological conditions. So we need other reliable non-hormonal methods, I think.
Going back to why that might be in terms of these tailwinds and headwinds of what's present in the media, because I'm aware that other hormonal, I mean, completely changing the topic here, but in terms of HRT, hormone replacement therapy, it's really waxed and waned, hasn't it? In terms of there's been moments in our lifespan where it's been, again, vilified and outcast and thrown out.
That's a really good point, actually. I hadn't even really computed that in some ways. Like, HRT is very popular at the moment, but I think maybe there have been more advances in HRT and more natural feeling hormones than there have been in contraception in recent decades.
Annie, do you know much about the male pill in terms of, I know I've read a lot about this and the trials going on. Are you able to briefly explain where we are with that?
Well, there have been trials going on for quite a long time into male contraceptives, but my understanding is that they've never really got past the trial stage because of unacceptable side effects, which is interesting.
Really? What have the side effects been?
Well,
Probably
hormonal
just
side effects.
any side effects.
And that men are just...
Low mood, spotty,
Oh, wow. And the idea of men just not accepting that we would take on that
But fair
change.
enough, but why should women,
Exactly,
And I think that's part of this movement away from it. But I think we need to find better rather than going back to things that don't work as well. Probably should also mention that there are other issues to be taken into consideration when making contraceptive choice, and that for some people it is extremely important to be on as reliable a method as is available, such as women who are using teratogenic medications for epilepsy and other conditions where it really would be disastrous to get pregnant, and women who have medical conditions that would make pregnancy very unsafe for them, for example. And the final other thing that I wanted to mention is that natural family planning methods, along with hormonal methods, do not protect against STIs. So just a last little plug for the condom.
Excellent. Well, I think we're drawing to a natural close now. So I wanted to say a couple of things. Firstly, thank you for coming on, Annie. The second thing, I guess, is I'm just conscious of where we're coming from. And I think that's why it's been so helpful to have you on, because I think people can quite rightly take umbrage with two men saying that a new non-hormonal method of contraception is so ineffective and isn't it awful that everyone's using this when we're not the ones experiencing the quite significant side effects that we've been through. I think my takeaway from all of this is that, as you say, there need to be advances to give opportunities for a contraception that is suitable for everyone, right? And it feels like we're not quite there yet, but I think there are certainly a lot of options available. If you're not happy with what you're taking, or if you are concerned about the side effects, then talking to someone who knows about this stuff, so your doctor, is usually the right way forward.
Absolutely. Can I just say thank you for having me? It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Annie, for coming on. It's been great to actually have someone guide us through this fairly complicated and treacherous topic for us two men. Despite being GPs, this can be quite a complicated topic. So thank you.